webinar, Agile is More Than Software. This is a collaboration between Shubar Associates and
Lean Agile Partners.
And we want to thank our hosts, IQPC, who are sponsoring the Software Design for Medical Devices conference here in Boston that we'll talk about at the very end of this presentation. But to get right into our topic, we believe that the Agile approach is something that applies to more than just software development, and we'd like to show you how that's the case.
Our names.
I'm Brian Shoemaker.
And I'm Nancy Venture-Underwood. Good morning.
And here we are. I'm originally an analytical chemist, and from the chemistry background through assay development in the clinical diagnostics field, I ended up graduating into software quality. That's a long kinked career that I don't want to get into here, but I've been working in the software quality area at I made the wrong correction there. It should be 13 years as an independent validation consultant, but that's all right. I've been doing work with largely medical device companies, but also with clinical trial data management, and I've been doing a lot of work with software validation, Part 11, which is the electronic records and signatures, the software quality systems and auditing and in training in all of those areas.
Okay, and I'm Nancy Venture-Underwood. I started off as an electronics designer with a lot of software background from college because I got very interested in that along the way. I've been working my whole career in safety critical applications that involve software and hardware. So I'm very familiar with both. I've worked in aerospace and flight simulation, medical devices, also control systems like factory automation, and I've coached Agile teams in most of those areas and also in financial services. And I'm very active in the local Agile community here in the Boston area. I'm a past president of Agile New England and a founder of that group. And I speak at a lot of conferences.
Which we've been doing together for some number of years now.
Yes, we have.
We believe that Agile as an approach, I don't mean it as a canned system, and I'll come back to that later on. We believe that Agile as an approach, as a mindset, can be applied to a number of different areas, and we've chosen these three: the quality procedures, the hardware development, and risk management as ways of showing examples of how the Agile can be applied outside just software development. So let's take a look at these slices. In the very first case, my view is that Agile is a road toward quality improvement, and it fits very well with the whole idea of continuous improvement. That under an Agile approach, SOPs, standard operating procedures, add value because they're an integral part of our feedback loops. Any kind of an Agile team does regular retrospectives, and the process that we use in addition to the product that we're developing is a very important element of those retrospectives. Now, let's go back to some real fundamentals. Let's look at the V diagram. Are these steps really linear? Do you ever know all of your user needs before you ever get started with high-level analysis? Do you ever have all of your high-level analysis complete before you can ever start any architecture or design or any coding or whatever? Of course not. That's never the case in a real product. Sure, you get as much information as you can when you begin, but there's always bits and pieces that you don't know or that the people you're developing for can't really express until they've seen something as an example. So what's missing in these steps is feedback. And feedback is going to be something we keep coming back to over and over again in this presentation. Feedback and learning and adjusting. And so with that in mind then, I'll also point out these boxes, which are very nicely linked to each other, may not be linked to each other in a time relationship, rather in a conceptual relationship. There are levels in our concepts, but that doesn't mean we do everything at one level before we can do anything at the next level. So let's take a look at procedures in that context that I'm just talking about, in the context of feedback. One of the things that Nancy and I share is that before we even knew each other, each of us was active in private aviation. I have a single engine land license. I also have quite a number of hundreds of hours in flying a sailplane.
Yeah, and I got interested in flying when I worked in flight simulation. I knew all the software and hardware, but I didn't know enough about the vehicle. And then I got hooked. We discovered that after we knew each other for some years, didn't we?
Yeah, that's true. And one of the key things in the aviation field is VFR or IFR, whether you're flying visual or on instruments, use your checklist. In other words, you know certain things. Make sure you don't forget any of those things that you do know so that you can focus on the stuff that you need to be able to adjust to, which a good pilot is doing all the time. So we have processes that underlie the things that we're doing. For medical devices, we have a process of doing risk management, of evaluating risks early and coming back to them and looking them over again. I'll come back to that topic later on here in this presentation. We have procedures for capturing and managing software defects, for making sure that we have the right configuration and keeping control of what the current code is. We have, when we're ready to go to market, we have a procedure for releasing software to make sure we haven't forgotten any steps in order to get it out to market. So those procedures support the processes. Those are the ways that we make sure we check things off that we know we're going to need to check off and not forget those important things. But that allows us then to focus on the stuff that we don't know and need to learn as we're going through a development or a correction kind of a process. But I'll ask you this question, obviously a leading question. Are the SOPs, the procedures that we write down, solid and cast in stone, never to be changed? Obviously not. One of the important elements of a good quality system is that it's continuously improving. So our procedures are never perfect and permanent. We can always improve them. So the idea is that we use what we understand and what we recognize from the way that a given team works to improve those procedures. We know we need to learn. Each time we go through an iteration developing a product, we do a design, development, test, and demonstration. So in that same line, we consider our procedures as well as product design and plan for multiple iterations. This is the key. This is the underlying concept of continuous improvement.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's it also reminds me of, if you think in the arts and theater, the reason opening night comes off well is because they did a bunch of dress rehearsals before they came up to it.
Absolutely.
And those things really matter. Getting all your pieces lined up and doing it exactly as the way you want to, have the end result come out. The more times around the loop, the better it's going to come off.
So I've represented here the way that development occurs. So we allow documentation to grow as the work goes along. Each of those circles of the arrows is an iteration or sprint, and we add to a software requirements document, a software design document, and verification and validation tests at the same time as we're building a product. Well, on that same line then, let's think about the feedback that happens as we're doing in that same development process, the feedback that can happen on the other side, on the procedure side. So plan, do, check, act is a cycle that's very well known in the quality field. So, and we apply that to our product all the time. We think about how we're going to design some feature, we put it in there, we check it by doing a demonstration. Is this really what's going to work well for your workflow? And then we make corrections. Well, the same thing happens with procedures, with processes. We plan how a process should work out, we use it, we reflect on it and say what worked well, what didn't work well, and we make corrections. And the two interact with each other. That's what makes our whole environment agile.
I couldn't agree more. And this notion of having checklists is I just want to put it in perspective too, because there are parts of the job that you know that are well understood, and following a checklist makes sense. Some people think that that's not agile, but it is for the parts that are well understood. But there's always aspects of what you're building that you're not so sure of at any given time. You might not be totally sure how something ought to work, or maybe you've got a problem, maybe you've got a defect, and you're not sure, you're searching around for what, what's the problem, or can we do a quick fix because something's broken in the field. So you have these places where you're not so sure, and a checklist won't help you in those places. But if you use it wherever it will help you, then, like Brian said a few minutes ago, you save your focus time to really look at the places where you have to be dynamic in the moment. And Agile brings a lot of good practices to the idea of being able to take the best idea that the whole group can come up with, that the whole team can come up with. There are a number of Agile practices that help stimulate that, help people to key off of one another. Just like, as I mentioned, the theater production a minute ago as an analogy, when things start to go wrong, as long as all the players understand where they're trying to head to, they can compensate for one another in the moment. Aha, okay, it's my turn to talk a little bit about Agile for hardware environment. Okay, well, first of all, let me just say something. I'm going to give you some examples that come from a project that I worked on around the time Agile was just emerging. And since there wasn't really a well-formed Agile community, and we hadn't heard of Scrum and things like that at the time, I was keying off what I knew from my pilot training. I was keying off of, let's be really disciplined wherever the problem we're dealing with is well understood, like planning and so forth, and let's find ways to work really cooperatively as a whole team, wherever we really have to be dynamic. So I was going from a philosophy like that. Now, whenever you first bring up hardware working with software, the first thing people say is, wait, we can't do hardware changes in 2-week cycles or anything like that. That's a typical length of time for an Agile software team to work in a sprint or an iteration. A couple weeks is very common these days. And hardware people say, no, that's crazy. And they're right. There are many aspects of hardware that have very long lead times and just long development cycles. But there are also an increasing array of ways to mitigate that and to bring hardware loops. They can be brought in very tight through simulation, programmable devices, and things of that nature. But that's always been true. That's been true for a long time. It's still true today. It's getting even shorter cycles. But I'm not saying that that's going to totally change it and make all hardware be something that you can do on 2-week cycles. But we don't need to. That's the key. You don't even need to, because it's been my experience that the different cycle lengths don't really bring up a conflict. They can complement one another. So what I'm trying to say is, if you look at this diagram that's up right now, you can see a picture here of an illustration of software iterations. Let's say those are 2-week cycles, each one of those little breaks. And you could imagine a software team like that working with electronics team that maybe is going to get a new spin on their circuit board every few months or so, or every month. They might be working with mechanical engineering or other engineerings that work on an even longer cycle. Okay, that's fine too. But let me give you a little example of how these things can complement one another. My own team doing the software, we found that when we were running an algorithm in our spectrometer instrument, we found that sometimes the algorithm wouldn't complete. And we knew that we had implemented it correctly and that it should complete, it should get a valid answer. And when we would talk to the electronics folks, we'd discover, they checked the test points on the board and found that there was a voltage level that was out of spec somewhere on the board, due to a component that was aging or not quite right. So we said, okay, we can learn from that, and we can learn to detect that as a potential cause of a problem with the algorithm. Not only can we do that, but we could monitor some of those voltage points and even build a trace of their behavior out in the field. And that would greatly help the electronics engineers because this whole project was new, the hardware and the software. And so they were needing help understanding what was really going on in the field, when that circuitry was in use. So what I'm trying to say here, the point is that at every one of these little junctures, at every time one of these periods comes to a close, there's a learning point. We've found something out. We've tested our configuration now with new software and or new electronics and so forth, and we've learned something. Not only and the learning doesn't stay limited to just one discipline. It spans all of them. The software and the electronics. We worked interrelated with the EEs a lot, and there were many things we could do that helped them along, and lots of things they could do to help us along. So that's what I'm saying about the different cycle times didn't really become a roadblock at all. It wasn't something we had to overcome. The main benefit to speeding it up is we just get quicker learning. So let me dive in a little further to this spectrometer example that I'm bringing up. This was a product that I was technical lead for the software team. This was embedded real-time software. And we were part of a larger group that included opto engineers, material scientists, mechanical engineers, electronics engineers. And we had initially a customer in agriculture, but we had another customer in the pipeline interested in medical applications like blood analysis. And so our process got put through an audit. And we were doing an early flavor of an Agile process. But remember, as I said, the Agile community hadn't really formed at the time. I was going based on ideas from Deming, the Plan, Do, Check, Act kind of ideas, and ideas from my pilot training, and from things that I learned in aerospace about what good quality procedures are like. So in this product, we were going to have real-time data readouts that had laboratory accuracy. We had a lot of technology risks because even the scientific principle we were using of near-infrared spectroscopy, there was a different twist on it that was being implemented. And so we were also using a new microprocessor because the algorithm we had to run was pretty complicated. And we had a new sensor also being built by our company. And the mathematical algorithm was under design too. So there was really not too many solid anchors in this project. With all of that going on, what happened was, because the Agile team was running on the quickest cycles, we could learn the fastest and we could help all the other groups. We delivered, and I don't mean just the Agile software team, the whole project team delivered working field units within a 6-month period. They could be tried out by our beta customers, and then we were getting feedback from the field. Over the next 3 years of development, we probably did something on the order of a little over 60 software iterations. We had several upgrades of the electronics, and also several of the mechanical housing and other mechanical components. So altogether, this gave us a period of time where we were turning things around, learning fast, helping one another, the different engineering groups. In the 3 years total, we were tracking our defects. We were very proactive about software defect prevention. And we were recording something as a defect if it showed up at integration test or later. And only 51 grand total emerged in the whole 3-year period. So that's quite low. I mean, I was expecting dozens or hundreds, and I would have even thought that was good progress, because for software of that size, I did a computation somewhere, and I found that it would be expected to have many hundreds of defects, and that would have been considered decent performance. Thousands would have been considered bad performance. Let me give you an example. I want to talk about documentation a little bit. I want to pick up on what Brian was saying too about the importance of that communication. And I want to talk to you about documentation through executable specifications. As technical lead, I started thinking right from the get-go about having some kind of a built-in test mode, because I was thinking it's going to be a nightmare if we have to hand debug all of that mathematical algorithm. I mean, for them to just communicate it to us initially was 26 pages of math, matrix math, and all kinds of formulas. And just thinking about it was, you know, you could easily see a lot of time going into an initial implementation of it, and it being very difficult to debug, you know, where something might have gone wrong in all these stages of the math. So what we did was we talked to the mathematicians early on. I mean, they were designing their algorithm using MATLAB, and we said to them, how about, we know we're going to have to re-implement this algorithm many times because it's under development. You know, they were going to be changing their mind almost continuously. And we needed to be able to keep up with them once we had real hardware in the field. So what we did was we said, let's create a system. Let's create a system that we're going to keep in the product. We're not going to take it out on, you know, when we first start production units. We're going to keep a system in here that will support us for implementing and retesting this algorithm as many times as it takes, and then maintenance into the future. So what we did was we said to them, I'm going to show you a diagram next where we show what we did. We said, in your, look at the row across the bottom, this is what the mathematicians were doing in MATLAB. You could think of MATLAB being their specification generator in a sense. They would take dummy data because we didn't have the sensor working yet, and they would feed it into their algorithm. And when they got results that they were satisfied with, they would declare their algorithm to be the version they wanted implemented. Fair enough. What we wanted to do was be able to just flip a switch in our software, take that dummy data into our implementation that's shown in the upper path here, in place of sensor data, just to make sure that we implemented the algorithm exactly the way they had. And then we asked them, in addition to telling us the math steps, which of course they would anyway, we wanted them to deliver their intermediate data to us from each step. That way we could narrow down any problems we had. We could narrow them down very quickly. So the upshot of this was, if they gave us a new version of the algorithm on Tuesday afternoon, by the end of the day, we could have it implemented and fully tested, not just unit tested, but regression tested with our automated regression tests. And this held all through the project. So in effect, what really happened was we never relied again on a paper specification from them to us. We essentially had them delivering to us test cases and data to use in it. And so throughout development, we were able to implement a new algorithm faster than the mathematicians could actually design a new algorithm. And that's how we stayed ahead of them and kept it really painless, I might add. So this is just one example of executable specifications. We did something like this with the electronics engineers as they were designing data, how do I put this, data conditioning circuitry on the front end. We built a little simulator each side of the interface. We had a joint venture partner where we had a complicated communications interface. And we built something like an executable specification to become our safety net, really, and our automated test framework. So let me move on. I want to show you here a pattern of working together. I've seen this pattern emerge in several situations. Let me first describe it. This picture is showing a typical Agile storyboard, or it could be a Kanban board. And, you know, you think you've got your, think of the column at the left as being the stories, the features that you're going to work on for your current sprint. I've got them put in colors when they're like a hardware or a software sprint. And the idea is most companies, they have their hardware teams quite isolated from the software teams. Things are built with hardware, and then, you know, they're made ready, and software team can now try out their software on it or write fresh software. Or maybe they've written software in parallel to the hardware, and now it's integration time. To the extent possible, it's better for you to focus on whole features rather than just shuttling the work into your existing skill silos like hardware, software. And for many features, you can do this because you can speed up the hardware cycle, like I alluded to at the beginning of this section where I said, you know, we have the program logic devices and so forth. You can't do it for all of them, so, you know, this isn't a 100% solution. But whenever you can make your work pattern more visual and more visible to everyone, it's always a benefit. And so in this little picture, I'm showing, like a hardware software person teaming up for a feature that's got some aspects of both. And people can work singly or in pairs, whatever, on other features, but just keeping the flow visible, knowing that we have a target date for certain features to be completed and fully working both our software and hardware aspects. That's what we're showing here. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next picture. I want to start wrapping up here. I want to give you some data that we actually saw with that project, and there have been many other projects also that have seen really impressive performance data. But let me focus here on the spectrometer project. All through the development period, 3 years' time, through most of that time, we had 0 defects open. For some periods, we had 1 or 2, but never more than that. There was never more than 2 open defects. I had it in my budget at first that I was going to buy a bug tracking tool, and I never quite got around to that because I could always remember which were the open defects. The total, I mentioned this already before, the total number of defects found during development and 30 days post-delivery to the field was 51. And when I say defects, I don't mean that only 51 mistakes were ever made by the Agile team. We made plenty of mistakes. There were plenty of bugs that got put into the code, but they didn't get past our unit tests. That's what I'm trying to say. They didn't get past our unit test levels, the vast majority of them. The only ones we actually had to chase and to solve were about 51 that whole time. That surprised me. It was better performance than I expected. We were able to use a database from a company called Qualitative Software Management, QSM. Their website's at the bottom of this website. We were able to use an online tool that they provided. They make software estimation tools, and they have a database of many commercial projects. So we were able to compare our performance against similar real-time embedded software teams. So we came out in the 90th percentile schedule-wise. In other words, our schedule compliance was better than 90% of the teams they had analyzed. We had much less effort expended in order to get to that point, and the errors discovered were like a standard deviation below the average that they had in their database. So there is independent data that we compared against this one and others too. They're in a report that's in the references section of the slide deck if you're interested in finding out more. And there's also experience by other teams too. I don't have time in our segment today to go into all of that, but I just wanted to give you some real examples of what's happened. And this slide just shows my explanation for why we achieved those performance levels. I might also add that my team was not working 100-hour weeks to do this. The team members were actually working close to a 40-hour week all through this. I was working a little bit more, but not drastically more than that, but because I was a team lead. But we were not working killer hours to do this. We did it through the process. And my explanation is that at every one of these junctures you see at the end of a delivery period, whether it's for electronics or mechanical or software, at every one of those junctures, every person on the team can see firsthand where we're at. Everybody could run the software on the hardware set that's either on their desk or that's in the lab readily available. So everyone could have their own understanding of what the software and the hardware actually are doing right at this moment. And they could all think together about what needs to happen next to keep us on track. So I think that what the real dynamic change that happened was we improved the quality and the speed of communication between people to such a level that we avoided so many of the blind alleys and rabbit holes that you get lost in a big complicated project when you're communicating just through documents on paper. So that's all I have for this section. I'm going to turn things back to Brian now. He's been very patient for a few minutes. Here you go, Brian.
All right. Well, in all of this, I mentioned risk management in what we talked about a few minutes ago. And especially for medical device design, risk management is absolutely essential throughout our process. What I'll point out is that risk management goes very nicely hand in hand with an agile continuous learning approach, because risk management by its very nature is an iterative process. As ISO 14971, the risk management standard, says, the manufacturer shall establish, document, and maintain throughout the life cycle an ongoing process for analyzing, evaluating, controlling risk. That ongoing means you don't just analyze risks at the beginning of the project and then put that document on the shelf to gather dust, because that's worthless. It has to be do it early and do it often. And what I'll compare is in an Agile type of approach, we recognize that early in a project our requirements, if you want to call them that, are preliminary, high level, and approximate. And as we do our development, as we implement these things, they become much more refined, much more detailed, and much more specific. In the same way, the hazards that we understand early in a project, as we go along implementing, the mitigations for those hazards become more refined, detailed, and specific. So these two go hand in hand. Let's take a concrete example. There's been a lot of work on the part of a number of companies in the area of the artificial pancreas or bionic pancreas, which is a closed-loop control system that for managing blood glucose in type 1 diabetics. It consists of a continuous glucose monitor, which is attached to the skin, and which is measuring glucose in a constant fashion, in communication in some way with an insulin pump, which is delivering insulin into the person's system via some sort of an infusion set that's also attached to the skin. And this system is constantly adjusting to how the person's blood glucose is behaving. So there are some very interesting considerations that come up when you think about risk management, because if a diabetic who cannot make insulin, that's the type 1 diabetic, gets too high a glucose level or too low a glucose level, there are health risks in both extremes. So let's think about this kind of system. Typically, a continuous glucose monitor, or CGM, is communicating with the attached pump via Bluetooth, hence the little blue symbol there. And the pump has the smarts, the algorithm, and a user interface, and the pump is controlling that infusion set. So when we look at a system of that sort, who are the people that should take part in that hazard analysis? Clearly, there needs to be the engineers who are saying, well, this thing could do this, or it could do that, or it could have this error taking place, or it could, the continuous glucose monitor might fail, or you need to replace it on a certain frequency. But beyond them, you would want to have clinicians, people who are experts in diabetes management. You would want to have people who are actual patients who use insulin pumps, say, yeah, that worked well for me, but it was difficult to do such and such and so on and so forth.
So this is a point where a checklist isn't going to do it for you. This is a point where you want to stop and gather the best ideas from your group of people, chosen, as you just said, the right kind of specialists.
And as we go along in that project, we may recognize other types of stakeholders who should take part in that conversation of what are the kinds of risks that could take place, and what are the bad things, that is, what kinds of hazards could be there. Now let's make the project even more complicated. Now, of course, we want to make sure that we learn as much as we can from animal studies and trials to know how that kind of a feedback loop system works, and at least in some sort of a model system. But let's make that project, let's throw something else into that project, because your marketing people who are keeping close tabs, I would hope, in the development, come down the hall and say, we're about to get scooped. This other company has made it so that their continuous artificial pancreas will also communicate glucose levels directly to the doctor's office via a smartphone and some kind of a cloud application. So you go, okay, well, we can add that into our design. But let's make sure when we do that, we're adjusting the changes in information, but let's make sure to think about what are some of the risks that we could potentially incur on adding that kind of feature. Are there ways that We could expose that kind of data to hacking or changing the data on its way to the doctor's office or something of that sort. So that's the ongoing, continuous consideration of hazards and ways of mitigating those hazards that's very important in this kind of project. And that requires conversations between, I said customers, but I really should say stakeholders in this first thing, and delivery team being engineers who were designing. So the old way, the bad old way, was to write a big long document and throw it over the wall, and then try to flesh out details of that document by having conversations where we need it. Let's flip that on its head and say, okay, let's have those conversations between the people who need to use the system and the people who need to sell that system, the stakeholders on the one side, and the delivery team on the other side, and then out of those conversations, capture that information.
Yeah, and a great example of that is the interaction we had with the mathematicians on our project. You know, we started by sitting down and talking with them after we looked at the spec initially and ran some studies to figure out if the microprocessor could even handle that algorithm. You know, we had a talk with them, and we talked to them at first about this notion of, can we just key off of your MATLAB code and your intermediate results? And as we talked it through, we felt, yeah, that's going to be a time saver for both of us. So that was the conversation. And then we supported that by the documentation, if you will. And in this case, that's when we cooked up the formats for them to deliver us their intermediate results.
So that
algorithm.
What that then tells us is that we need to broaden our concept of what documentation consists of. And I've run this by regulators and auditors in several circumstances, and everybody is perfectly happy with the concept. You don't have to have a big, long prose document for it to be considered documentation.
Yeah, we've talked with FDA people and lots of folks at medical conferences, and they understood. A lot of the people in the regulatory bodies understand this, both in Europe and the U.S. Just one more point I want to make before you move on, Brian. I think one of the areas where people got misconceptions about Agile early on is they seem to have gotten the idea that the conversation part is all that we advocate having. You know, you just talk it through, and then everybody's off in a rush, to get the speed that Agile delivers. Nothing could be further from the truth. We got speed from having the right safety nets in place and from not putting repeated labor into things that we could automate. So, and we use checklists for all the kinds of things that are well understood that we just don't want to forget. But the point about the conversation is that's where you fill in for those things that you didn't understand up front, or new developments that just came up, like they couldn't have done the hazard analysis about the communication by smartphone because that was a feature requested later in the project. So, they wouldn't have known about it up front. So we're not talking about only conversations. We're talking about there's an important and necessary time to tap the knowledge of a group and to just do it in real time so people can key off of one another. And you get a lot of benefit when you make that possible. So conversation is not the only thing. That seems to have been a misconception that spawned a long time ago and gave some people in the safety critical world, gave them the idea that Agile is just too flimsy for their needs.
So the point here is that risk management is the same as it always has been. You plan, you check, you act. That's the cycle in quality processes. Risk management follows essentially the same sort of thing. Agile doesn't change that. It's that the cyclic nature of doing risk management works very nicely within an Agile context. And we know that our early analysis isn't something that's going to live forever. We have to review it and revise it as we go along, as we do more and more iterations of our process.
We've got some takeaway concepts now.
So some of the key thoughts, and many of these Nancy will be able to speak to.
All right, well, I'll start off with the first few. There's this moment of truth that has to come early and often, and what I mean by that is at the end of each sprint, the software has to be thoroughly tested. So many companies don't do this. So many of them say, well, that would be too lengthy, so we're just going to test the parts we added. That's not good enough. It's not real agile if you didn't invest in building your safety net, building your automated regression tests, and you have to build them in a way that you can maintain. So there's a lot of knowledge in that. It's not enough to just work iteration by iteration and not thoroughly test. The whole point, the benefit that you get from that whole team's understanding is that they all have an example in front of them of something that works right now. And we have a set of software, a set of hardware that's completed up to a certain point. And by having that same reality underneath everybody on the team, that enables them to all contribute their understanding and their ideas in a useful way to what steps to take next. This notion about zero defects, lots of people use that phrase. I don't have a problem with it, but I don't mean zero in a literal sense. I mean, it's not like we had 0 bugs. We had those 51, I'll confess to it, but I'm still proud of the result that we got. Let me define zero defects as meaning you don't have to fear that your budget or your reputation or your schedule is going to go up in flames due to bugs. It's not that we totally eliminated them from the picture. We eliminated so many and we built so much trust with our customer that we never had to worry that we were going to have to drastically delay a release or anything like that because of defects cropping up that we didn't know how to solve. So that's a practical reality that we achieved, and I've seen other teams achieve it as well. So there's different kinds of work that can flow and blend smoothly. This notion of the hardware and the software having very different cycle lengths doesn't have to be a conflict. Teams have mixed other flavors of work, like operations and software development. It's not just only software and hardware. In our case, I mentioned the algorithm design and software. So different kinds of work can blend smoothly.
And I keep coming back to this point that mindset is what we're talking about. Some quality people will say, well, what's your Agile SOP? And I'm going, there is no Agile SOP. There is no canned one thing that's Agile. It's an approach. It's a way of working. And that way of working affects not just the software development area. We've talked about 3 different specific areas, but the applicability goes across a number of different things: marketing, budgeting, project planning, human resources and management. All of them can be affected by that mindset of we can learn and improve as we go along. The concept is that in a classical company, you've got different people doing different kinds of work, sitting at different sections of the company and never talking with each other. But we're saying, let's build some bridges between those different areas, hardware and software, R&D and engineering between them and clinical. I was in a conversation with a group talking about hazard analysis a few years ago, and they said, well, our clinical people usually don't take part in our hazard analysis processes. And I go, why not? They should be part of that team, and certainly marketing, who need to keep their thumb on the pulse of what's going on in the marketplace.
Well, here's our contact information. We'd appreciate it if you follow us on Twitter. We'll tell you about upcoming things and other good news for you to know about. And there's some references. I mentioned some of these as I went through the talk. And we have our coming events on the next slide. Here we go.
So in late January, the Software Design for Medical Devices Conference will be right here in Boston, and we'll both be taking part in that. Right. There's another one taking place in Munich, Germany, late in February, and then a medical device clinical pathways to clinical introduction happening in March, which is a brand new conference.
And that also, all these are organized by IQPC. Do we want to say any more about the one coming up in Boston?
I don't have anything more. Yes.
We're both giving some talks at that, and
there will actually
be a lot of great talks there.
There will be a lot of close collaboration with Dr. Julian Goldman's medical device plug-and-play laboratory, so it's going to be well worth it if you can attend. We'll turn this back over to our IQPC host.
Thank you very much, Brian and Nancy, for an amazing presentation, and I look forward to hearing from both of you next month in Boston. Just a quick introduction. My name is Stephen Aponte, and I am, working on the Software Design for Medical Device Summit. I want to thank all of you for attending today, and I would like to personally extend our Cyber Monday offer at 50% off standard registration for all of you to join us next month. We will follow up shortly with you after this session is concluded, with some more information about the events. And then if you have any other further questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And once again, thank you everybody for participating, and Brian and Nancy for the great presentation.
Do we have any questions from the audience right now?
We do have a couple questions. It's just there was one that said, will the slides be available to us after? And we will have a link that will be sent around for everybody to see of the recording of the session. And then will the slides be available, Brian and Nancy?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll provide a PDF of the slides that you can distribute. No problem.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I appreciate all the time today, and everyone have a great day.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Thank you so much.
All right.